The first warning wasn't a sound. It was a vibration running through the hull of a small Japanese picket ship, just a low, gut-level tremor that made every man on deck freeze. Seconds later, a shadow the size of a moving cliff pushed through the morning haze. No cruiser matched that profile. No battleship in their manuals carried turrets that large, and yet, there it was, a steel giant emerging from the fog as if the ocean itself had lifted it to the surface. The forward turret alone, 3 16-inch Mark 7 guns, each able to fire a 2,700-pound shell at nearly Mach 2, looked like a weapon forged to end wars, not start them. The crew panicked, radios jammed, rangefinders shook. Nobody knew how it got there. Nobody knew how they had found him by accident. And absolutely nobody imagined it could be the USS Iowa. Before we dive into what happened next, before we break down why an accidental encounter with the most powerful battleship America ever created turned into one of the most alarming moments of the entire Pacific War, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you in California? Maybe Texas? Could be New York, Florida, or some small town I've never even heard of. Drop your city in the comments because I genuinely want to see how far this story is reaching. And while you're there, tap that like button if this kind of high-intensity naval history grabs you the way it grabs me. It tells the platform you want more stories like this. Real hardware, real stakes, real battles that shaped the world. And if you haven't joined us yet, now's the moment. Hit subscribe and stay locked in. What the Iowa does next is something no patrol crew on Earth was prepared to witness. What happened in the next minutes would later appear in fragmented intelligence notes, shaken survivor testimonies, and one chilling radio intercept, but none of them capture the raw shock of the moment. The Japanese picket crew had no idea that the ship they were staring at, displaced over 58,000 tons at full combat load, carried armor nearly a foot thick along its belt, and could throw a broadside that shook the ocean like a geological event. All they knew was that the silhouette approaching them didn't belong anywhere near that sector. It wasn't scheduled, it wasn't expected, and nothing that size should have been able to move that quietly. Men scrambled across the deck, tripping over coils of rope and ammunition crates, shouting orders that contradicted the last ones. Someone yelled to power the search radar, someone else yelled to shut it down. The officer in command froze as he looked through his binoculars and finally recognized the impossible. A towering superstructure, enclosed directors, and the unmistakable outline of 3 gun turrets that only one class of battleship on Earth carried. It couldn't be true. Not here. Not this far forward. The Iowa advanced with a calmness that felt unnatural for a 212-meter warship capable of pushing over 32 knots. The ocean around her didn't roar or churn violently. It simply parted. Her engines, 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers feeding 4 General Electric turbines, were humming at a low, restrained tone, as if the ship herself were holding her breath. On the Japanese vessel, sailors grabbed Type 93 binoculars, wiping sweat from the lenses, checking, rechecking, and still failing to believe what they saw. The USS Iowa wasn't supposed to be anywhere near their reconnaissance net. American battleships rarely operated alone, and never this deep. And yet there she was, sliding through the mist with the precision of a predator that has already chosen its target. Some of the younger sailors had only heard rumors about Iowa-class ships. Stories passed quietly between crews about American firepower that sounded exaggerated, fantastical even. Tales of armor-piercing shells weighing more than compact cars, capable of punching through 18 inches of hardened steel. Stories of radar-directed fire control systems that could track a target through smoke, rain, and darkness. But every veteran officer on that picket ship knew those weren't stories. The Mach 8 fire control radar mounted on Iowa's forward tower was more advanced than anything the Imperial Navy fielded. It could lock onto a surface contact beyond the horizon and compute a firing solution before the enemy even completed their first evasion turn. A trembling hand reached for the radio. Static filled the cabin. The operator tuned and retuned the frequency, but the bandwidth was already cluttered by other outposts reporting sightings of American aircraft, none realizing that what stood before them was infinitely more dangerous. The officer shouted to send a coded warning immediately, but the message stuttered as panic overtook discipline. Every attempt to relay the identity of the intruder came out scrambled. They didn't have the right code word. They didn't have the range. They didn't have time. Meanwhile, aboard the Iowa, the scene couldn't have been more different. Calm voices, steady footsteps. A ship run by men who had drilled this scenario 1,000 times in silence and 100 times under fire. Spotters scanned the horizon from armored positions, relaying bearings with mechanical precision. The gunnery officer reviewed telemetry from the Mach 37 director, while the plotting room updated target motion data using electromechanical computers that could process ballistic arcs faster than any human brain. One petty officer wiped condensation off the face of a range dial and whispered, "They don't know what they've run into." The Iowa wasn't hunting this ship. She hadn't been sent to destroy a stray picket. This encounter wasn't planned by either side. But the moment recognition clicked on the Japanese bridge, one truth became unmistakable. They were staring at a battleship built to outrun cruisers, outgun everything afloat, and survive hits that would sink lesser ships outright. They had found him by accident, an accident that carried consequences none of them could yet comprehend. The first officer on the Japanese picket ship finally managed to push a coherent message through the static, but the transmission went out half-broken, distorted by the ship's trembling generator and the panic flooding every spoken syllable. The fragment that reached the nearest command post contained no course, no distance, no assessment, only 5 chaotic words repeated twice before the signal cut out entirely. Huge battleship. Not ours. No one on the receiving end understood the gravity yet. They assumed it was an exaggeration, maybe a misidentified cruiser, maybe just nerves. But on the water there was no misidentifying the beast closing the distance. The Iowa's massive bow displaced the swells ahead of her like a plow moving through earth. Her anchor chains clinked softly against steel as the ship adjusted trim. Even the air felt heavier as she advanced, carrying the low metallic resonance of machinery, engineered for war on a scale the Japanese sailors had never even imagined. Some of the men on the picket ship had been present during American carrier airstrikes, had seen F-6F Hellcats dive through clouds at impossible angles, or watched SBD Dauntlesses fold bomber wings with a single well-placed bomb. But this felt nothing like that. Aircraft destroyed from above. This felt like being hunted by something ancient, something territorial, something that didn't need altitude or surprise. It only needed line of sight. One sailor muttered, voice shaking, that the Iowa looked less like a ship and more like a moving fortress, an armored city sliding across the waves. Another whispered that its guns looked large enough to punch a hole straight through the planet. None of them were wrong. Aboard the Iowa, the radar operators confirmed the contact at less than 17,000 yards. A small vessel, lightly armed, low tonnage, no threat to speak of, yet positioned exactly where no enemy ship should be this early in the patrol. The officer of the deck gave a quiet order. The ship adjusted 2 degrees to starboard. One engine throttled up slightly, the others compensated. The entire movement was so smooth it felt choreographed. There was no rush, no raised voices, no warning klaxon. Just the controlled, deliberate actions of a crew trained to operate the most advanced battle wagon afloat. In the plotting room, technicians fed bearing and speed estimates into the analog computers. Metal gears clacked softly, revolving through firing solutions as the Iowa's massive gyro-stabilized systems compensated for roll and pitch. Even at this relatively short range, the 16-inch guns could reduce the picket ship to fragments, but there was no immediate order to fire. Not because the Iowa lacked readiness, every gun could be loaded within seconds, but because something about this situation didn't align with expected enemy patterns. Pickets operated in nets. If they had found one, they were inside the perimeter of others. Somewhere beyond the haze, more eyes were watching. On the Japanese ship, the panic turned into something worse, silence. The kind of silence that occurs when every man understands instinctively that the situation has moved beyond human control. The helmsman turned the wheel, attempting a retreating angle. The engines groaned once, twice, then steadied at flank speed, but the vessel accelerated so slowly it felt like trying to drag a rowing boat away from a locomotive. They weren't outrunning anything. The Iowa could make 32.5 knots, faster than many cruisers, and she wasn't even pushing yet. Every sailor on that bridge knew the truth. Once the American battleship focused on them, escape wasn't possible. Survival depended on whether the giant chose to act. A gust of wind carried the distant hum of Iowa's turbines across the water. It didn't sound like engines, it sounded like power restrained. Men hid behind whatever cover they could find, ammo lockers, ventilation housings, even coiled lines, none of which would protect them from a 5-foot-long armor-piercing shell designed to penetrate battleship decks before detonating. But instinct made them crouch anyway. Humans hide even when hiding is meaningless. Back aboard the Iowa, observers watched the frantic movements on the picket ship with quiet focus. Through the optical sights of the Mach 38 director, the enemy vessel looked tiny, fragile, almost out of place against the vast blue canvas of the Pacific. One gun captain whispered that the ship looked nervous. The officer beside him replied that ships don't get nervous, men do. And on that small vessel there were many nervous men. The Iowa held her course. The range continued to close. And the moment no one expected, the moment that would change every Japanese patrol report for months, was about to begin. The ocean between the two ships narrowed with every passing second, and the Japanese crew felt that distance closing like a tightening noose. The officer on their bridge tried to keep composure, issuing calm commands, but even his voice cracked when he realized the Iowa wasn't altering course, wasn't slowing, wasn't signaling. A battleship that size on that trajectory wasn't interested in communication. It was assessing, measuring, and the cold efficiency of that silence terrified them more than any shot could have. Sailors rotated their 25mm Type 96 anti-aircraft mounts toward the Iowa in a gesture of desperation. But everyone knew those guns couldn't scratch American battleship armor. Their rounds would flatten on impact like pebbles thrown against a locomotive. Aboard the Iowa, the captain watched through high-powered binoculars, noting the frantic movement on the enemy deck. His crew remained quiet, steady, disciplined. Every position on the ship operated as if connected by a single heartbeat. The fire control teams checked wind speed, barometric pressure, and turret alignment. Powder bags sat ready, each filled with 660 pounds of propellant, ready to hurl the 5-foot-long Mach 8 armor-piercing shell at velocities exceeding 2,500 feet per second. Even at low charge, the gun could reach them instantly. But the Iowa's captain wasn't interested in obliterating a lone picket vessel. He wanted to understand why this ship was here. The Japanese lookout shouted that the Iowa's turrets had begun to shift. 3 colossal barrels rotated with deliberate precision, tracking the horizon, not the picket ship itself. The men watched those guns move with dread that felt almost physical, as if the air compressed around them. Those barrels weren't aimed at them yet, but the implication was clear. The Iowa was preparing for something larger, something beyond their sight. The realization hit the Japanese officer with a weight that almost knocked the breath from him. If the Iowa was here, deep inside their perimeter, then something catastrophic had already occurred somewhere behind them. Some defensive line had broken, some key position had fallen, something the Imperial Navy believed secure had failed. Otherwise, the Americans would never have sent a ship like the Iowa alone into these waters. The picket crew worked to get another message out, throwing every watt of power their failing generator could muster into the radio. They transmitted bearings, approximated distance, attempted a recognition code, begged for acknowledgement. The only response was static. The officer slammed the radio console with his fist, his knuckles splitting open. The operator looked at him with wide eyes, terrified not of the blow but of what it meant. They were isolated. On the Iowa, analysts in the Combat Information Center studied the fading transmissions from the Japanese ship. The words were distorted, but fragments were enough. Call signs they didn't recognize. Coordinates far from expected positions. A frequency used only in emergencies. Someone out there was warning someone else, and warning them frantically. The Iowa's captain understood. The encounter was no longer accidental. The Japanese were reacting to him, not the other way around. The ship accelerated, boilers roared, turbines surged, and the Iowa's bow lifted slightly as she pushed past 28 knots. The Japanese picket ship felt that acceleration in the water itself, a sudden shift in wake patterns. A rising hum carried across the surface. A gunner on their deck whispered that the American battleship was no longer approaching them. It was passing through them, and that was far more terrifying. If they weren't the target, then something behind them was. The officer ordered smokescreens deployed, though he knew it wouldn't matter. They launched canisters, releasing dense white trails that curled across the water, but the Iowa didn't even acknowledge it. Her radars pierced the haze effortlessly, scanning, triangulating, searching for whatever force the Japanese ship had been trying so desperately to warn. As the Iowa surged forward, the Japanese crew watched her stern disappear into the fog, the enormous propeller wash spreading like a thunderous scar across the sea. The moment the battleship vanished fully from view, the picket ship fell into absolute silence. Men frozen, breath held, hearts pounding, not because they had survived a close encounter, but because every man aboard understood something far more terrifying. They hadn't found the Iowa by accident. The Iowa had found something, and whatever that something was, it wasn't them. The fog began to thin as the Iowa pushed deeper into the sector, her hull slicing through the Pacific with the confidence of a machine built for absolute dominance. Inside the plotting room, gears clicked, servos hummed, and the analog computers continued refining firing solutions for targets no one had seen yet. The operators didn't need visuals. All they needed were echoes, tiny distortions in radar returns, faint shapes drifting at long range, movement patterns that suggested vessels attempting to reposition without drawing attention. The Iowa's systems picked up those signatures one by one, painting a picture of something larger, something organized, something trying to disappear into the morning haze. Up on the bridge, the captain tightened his grip on the railing as the range estimates came in. Multiple contacts, slow-moving, variable spacing. It wasn't a battle group, it wasn't a transport line. It looked almost like an evacuation column, ships trying to escape rather than engage. The Japanese picket hadn't stumbled into danger. It had tried to warn a fleet that was already fleeing from something far worse. The Iowa had crossed into their path by sheer momentum. Now the entire situation balanced on a razor's edge. The battleship's lookouts spotted silhouettes first, dark hulls barely visible against the horizon. Through binoculars, the shapes sharpened into the outlines of destroyers, light cruisers and escorts. Their decks bristled with Type 89 dual-purpose guns, torpedo launchers and searchlights. But none of those weapons were pointed at the Iowa. They were pointed away from her, as if they believed the threat was somewhere else entirely. A junior officer on the Iowa's bridge muttered that he'd never seen Japanese ships this disorganized. No formation discipline, no synchronized turns, no attempt to bring their guns to bear. It looked like panic without a known source. The captain remained silent, analyzing the pattern. If this group had been caught off guard, it meant their reconnaissance net had collapsed. If their net had collapsed, something enormous was happening beyond the horizon. And if they were running, they weren't running from him. They were running from American war plans unfolding faster than intelligence had been able to track. Below deck, the gun crews stood ready. Breech blocks gleamed with fresh lubrication, shell hoists sat loaded, powder bags had been stacked with meticulous precision. The men worked in silence, coordinated by gestures more than words. Every movement felt heavier, as if the ship itself sensed the magnitude of what was coming. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation, the kind that settles in the bones of men who serve aboard a vessel designed to reshape battles by simply arriving. The Japanese destroyers finally spotted the Iowa. Their behavior changed instantly. Searchlights snapped off. Signals blinked erratically between ships. Engines revved high, producing oily wakes that shimmered in the rising sun. One destroyer turned hard to port, nearly colliding with another in its attempt to reposition. Another accelerated to flank speed, its hull shuddering as it pushed far beyond safe limits. But they didn't close distance. They didn't charge. They spread out, widening the formation into a desperate arc, as if trying to create a corridor, an escape route, before the Iowa locked them in. On the American battleship, fire control radars shifted smoothly, acquiring each target with increasing clarity. The Mach 13 plotting table compiled distances, angles, rates of change. A crisp voice called out updated solutions, and the gunnery officer acknowledged them with a tone cold enough to chill steel. The ship was no longer guessing. She was preparing. The captain's mind worked through possibilities. Japanese destroyers didn't scatter like this unless something catastrophic had disrupted command structure. He ordered the Iowa's speed increased again. The boilers answered instantly, feeding steam into the massive turbines, propelling the ship forward with a controlled surge. At 30 knots, the water peeled away from the hull in wide, foaming sheets. The Japanese vessels responded by widening the gap even more. Their signals became frantic. Smoke canisters deployed. Some ships weaved erratically. Others held straight lines, engines screaming. But all of them shared one unmistakable intention. They were clearing a path. The Iowa pierced through that opening as though stepping onto a stage she had been built for. And just beyond the curtain of fog, something immense waited, something large enough to force an entire escort screen to scatter like debris in the wind. The fog thinned just enough to reveal a dark shape, broad, low, and unnervingly still. At first it looked like a shadow cast by the rising sun. Then the outline sharpened into armor plates, sharply angled superstructures, and the unmistakable bulk of a heavy cruiser that had taken a savage beating. Her stern sat low, listing slightly to port. The scars of recent airstrikes scorched across her decks. The Japanese escorts hadn't been escorting her. They had been shielding her. Whatever had torn into that cruiser had done it with such force that the entire formation looked stunned. A whispered murmur moved through the Iowa's bridge. Identifying features came into view: triple turrets, torpedo mounts, the silhouette of a Takao-class cruiser, or what was left of one. A ship displacing over 15,000 tons, reduced to a drifting casualty. Smoke seeped from ruptured ventilation ducts. Lifeboats hung half-destroyed. A section of her starboard hull had been peeled open, metal curled outward like torn paper. Yet her guns remained pointed forward, as if still trying to stare down the threat that crippled her. The Japanese destroyers reacted instantly when the Iowa spotted the cruiser. Several attempted to reform a barrier, but it was hopeless. The battleship's speed, momentum, and radar precision made every maneuver they attempted look painfully slow. Through the Mach 38 director, the cruiser's damage became clearer. One of her main turrets had jammed mid-rotation, its armored faceplate dented inward by a weapon of enormous kinetic force. That didn't happen from aircraft bombs, not even 1,000-pounders. Something had struck her at deck level and blown straight through. The Iowa's gunnery officer leaned toward the captain, lowered his voice, and said what everyone was thinking. Something hit her hard, harder than anything they were ready for. The captain didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth hung in the air like static. The Japanese cruiser attempted to move. Her screws churned, producing a frothy swirl behind the hull, but the response was sluggish, almost pitiful. Damaged machinery clanked loudly inside the superstructure. Bulkheads buckling, pumps overworked, engines struggling to maintain pressure. Even at maximum output, she wouldn't exceed 5 knots. A crippled giant trying to crawl away from a predator that could outpace her by more than 25. Aboard the cruiser, Japanese sailors sprinted across the deck, bracing hoses, shifting ammunition, shouting orders at one another through clouds of smoke. Some pointed desperately at the Iowa. Others didn't even bother. They already understood what was coming. A Takao-class cruiser couldn't survive a broadside from an Iowa-class battleship, not at this range, not in this condition. A single 2,700-pound Mark 8 shell could pass through her hull, ammunition stores, and engine rooms before detonating with enough force to fold the ship in half. And the Iowa carried 9 of those guns. The destroyers knew it too. One turned sharply and launched a spread of Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, likely out of panic rather than strategy. The Iowa's radar detected them instantly, thick metallic signatures slicing through the water at nearly 50 knots, propelled by oxygen-fueled engines. The long lance was one of Japan's most feared weapons, capable of traveling over 22 miles and carrying a warhead of more than 1,000 pounds of high explosive. Under normal circumstances, a salvo like this would make even a fast battleship sweat. But the Iowa didn't turn. She didn't flinch. Her engines adjusted power with mechanical elegance, sliding her just outside the projected intercept point by mere ship lengths. It wasn't chance. It was calculation. It was precision derived from radar, from training, from engineering that anticipated this moment years before the war began. On the Japanese destroyer, officers shouted in disbelief as the torpedoes streaked harmlessly past the Iowa's stern, leaving long white trails that cut through the sea like scars. The failure shattered what little confidence remained among the escorts. Several ships immediately deployed smoke. Others fled at full throttle. One destroyer broke formation entirely, trying to draw the Iowa away from the crippled cruiser, but the battleship didn't pursue. She had already chosen her focus. Her forward turrets locked with a slow, deliberate rotation. Each of the three massive barrels aligned as if guided by invisible rails, tracking the drifting, wounded cruiser. The Mach 8 radar tightened its beam. The plotting room finalized corrections. Every station aboard the Iowa synchronized into a single, lethal rhythm. The Japanese cruiser's crew steadied themselves, realizing they were looking directly into the broadside of a battleship that had never missed when it mattered. The Iowa steadied her course, engines humming at a low, predatory vibration that traveled through every steel frame of the ship. Inside the turret compartments, the crews moved with a ritualistic precision, the kind that can only come from thousands of drills practiced in silence and hundreds of hours spent preparing for a moment just like this. Powder bags were lifted into the hoists, shell trays locked into place, breech blocks slammed shut with a metallic finality that felt like the closing of a vault door. The massive guns of Turret 1, each barrel over 66 feet long, now pointed directly at the crippled cruiser, their dark interiors waiting for the order that would rewrite the sea. On the Japanese ship, the crew braced against the rails, gripping whatever they could as the Iowa's broadside loomed like a storm front. Officers shouted last commands, though most of them were drowned out by the sound of ruptured pipes, buckling bulkheads and machinery still trying to breathe life into a vessel that had already accepted its fate. Some sailors stared at the American battleship in disbelief, as if hoping the silhouette would vanish if they blinked enough times. Others bowed their heads, not out of resignation, but from the instinctive understanding that they were about to witness the full weight of American naval firepower. Aboard the Iowa, the fire control officer reviewed the final range. The Mach 8 computers converged on a firing solution that was brutally simple. The target wasn't moving fast enough to matter. The distance was so short that atmospheric corrections were almost irrelevant. Angle of fall, crosswind, drift, all negligible. The cruiser might as well have been anchored. The voice on the intercom delivered the final range with the steadiness of someone announcing the time of day. Everything was ready. And then, with a calm that chilled even the men who had heard it countless times in practice, the captain gave the order. The turret captain echoed it. The gun captains echoed it again. And deep inside the steel heart of Turret 1, the firing circuits completed. The Iowa spoke. The first 16-inch shell tore out of the barrel with a flash, bright enough to momentarily bleach the horizon. The shock wave slammed across the water like the opening of the earth. A pillar of flame and pressure roared outward, shaking the Japanese destroyers even at distance. A second shell followed, then a third, each leaving behind a tracer-thin disturbance as they ripped through the air at nearly Mach 2. The ocean flattened under the force. Birds scattered. Smoke enveloped the Iowa's bow, rolling along her decks like a living thing. The Japanese cruiser never stood a chance. The first shell punched through her forward decks, carving a glowing path through armor plating before detonating in the forward magazines. The explosion erupted with such violence that observers on the Iowa felt the shockwave through their boots. A towering column of flame and smoke burst upward, lifting debris hundreds of feet into the air. The second shell struck near the superstructure, blowing out compartments, rupturing fuel lines, and igniting fires that consumed entire sections of the ship in seconds. The third hit low, near the machinery spaces, shattering the keel with a blow that felt like a steel hammer smashing bone. For several moments, the cruiser remained upright, shuddering, collapsing internally, before the structural damage tore her apart. Her bow dipped sharply, swallowed by boiling water, while the stern lifted high enough to expose the screws. Men scrambled along the deck, clinging to anything that hadn't melted or torn loose, but the ship was already gone. Gravity claimed the wreck with terrifying speed, pulling it beneath the surface in a plume of shattered steel, steam, and oil. The sea closed over the spot as if swallowing a secret. The Japanese destroyers halted in shock. Engines idled, guns lowered. Smoke screens dissipated. Every man aboard those vessels watched in stunned silence as the ocean calmed, returning to an impossible stillness that made the destruction feel unreal. No one spoke, no one dared. Aboard the Iowa, the turret crews exhaled slowly. Instruments cooled, breech blocks opened, powder smoke drifted toward the stern. The ship did not celebrate. There was no triumph in the air, only professionalism, only precision. Only the weight of knowing that what they had just done was the result of engineering, training, and discipline at a scale the world had rarely seen. The Iowa resumed her course, engines powering forward, her bow slicing through the patch of sea where the cruiser had vanished moments before. There was no pause, no hesitation. Her mission pushed her onward. Behind her, the surviving Japanese escort ships began to withdraw. Slowly, cautiously, as though afraid that even their movements might attract the battleship's attention again. They had found the Iowa by accident. They would carry the memory of that mistake for the rest of their lives. In the calm that followed, as the Iowa pushed deeper into open water, her crew stood by their stations with the quiet pride of men who understood the weight of what their ship had just accomplished. The Pacific was wide again, the fog rolling behind them, the echoes of those 16-inch guns fading into memory. But the moment would live on, etched not only into reports and patrol logs, but in the minds of every sailor who witnessed the sheer precision of American naval engineering at its peak. The battleship had done exactly what she was built to do, guided by the steady hands of the men who trusted her with their lives. We honor them, the gunners, the spotters, the engineers deep in the boiler rooms, and the steel giant that carried them. Their courage, their discipline, and their mastery of the tools they commanded shaped history on that day. And they never flinched.